Undermining Gender Regulation, written by Dean Spade, found in the collection Nobody Passes, Rejecting the Rules of Gender and Conformity. Read May 29th, 2022 by Naomi Kirst-Schultz. Undermining Gender Regulation. I recently consulted with my friend Jessica, a brilliant astrologer psychic, and one of the things she told me was that my job was preventing me from expressing my gender. I think that would surprise most people. After all, I work at a non-profit that's one of the leading voices for gender deregulation in the country, and my job is to provide legal help to trans and gender non-conforming people, and to fight for changes in policies and laws that fuck us over. The thing is, doing this work puts me at the crux of debates within trans communities and within government bureaucracies about which gender expressions and identities merit recognition. Sadly, these debates frequently echo one another and involve horrendous distortions of trans realities and dangerous enforcement of regulatory norms. Yes, all communities that come together around shared identity traits regulate each other through ideals of realness. Yes, every time someone walks into the Sylvia Rivera Law Project and says, "You're Dean Spade," with a disappointed and aghast tone, and tells me they thought I'd be older, taller, more confident looking, look like a lawyer, and most importantly, look like a man, it's a little bit of a bummer. On some days, it's funny, and the part about not looking like a lawyer I take as a compliment. But I can't say that this obvious disappointment in my inadequate masculinity doesn't sting just a touch. My emergence into public trans politics was hastened by my arrest for trying to use a men's bathroom in Grand Central Station in 2002. Immediately following that, I was slammed on several trans listservs by people writing about how I must not pass if I'd been arrested, and I probably didn't even take tea, and I was an asshole and not a real trans guy for getting myself and my friends arrested. It felt horrible. I remember being afraid the first time I went to a big trans conference after that, of having people see me and know my name and judge me for how I looked. As much as I didn't believe in a vision of trans politics that required me to be traditionally masculine and passing in order not to be blameworthy for my illegal arrest and 23 hours in jail, I still felt insecure, and I remember trying to quote-unquote butch it up in community spaces where I might come under fire. People were pissed that I was representing myself in public as trans and was not passing as a non-trans man. Folks were concerned that the legitimacy of trans identity in the eyes of a transphobic culture is frequently tied to how normal and traditionally masculine or feminine trans people appear, and I was ruining it for everyone. But I am far less concerned overall about the authenticity hierarchies operating through social and political networks in the trans communities in which I participate than I am about the hierarchies operating in government policies and practices. The level of coercion in prisons and shelters, the level of violence and the vulnerability of the trans people in those contexts is far more appalling to me. State gender coercion disproportionately affects poor people, people of color, people who don't pass, people without educational privilege, people without healthcare, and immigrants. I have spent the last 4 years getting intimately acquainted with the variety of ways that coercive gender norms are worked into the policies and practices that the government applies to low-income people, and developing strategies for how to resist and undo these coercive mechanisms. There are a few different threads that run through all the battles we've been fighting, whether those battles are about driver's licenses, name changes, Medicaid, or juvenile justice facilities. All of these threads are about the authenticity of trans identities, and all are based on the idea that the state should determine people's gender identities, using binary gender as the standard. A primary premise running through policies that endanger trans people is the belief that no matter what trans people say or do, or how we understand ourselves or act, we are male if we are identified as male at birth, female if we were identified as female at birth. You can see the enforcement of this regulation in prisons, in juvenile justice facilities, in foster care group homes, in homeless shelters. Trans women are held in men's facilities, trans men in women's facilities, and gender non-conforming people in whatever facility matches their birth gender. You can also see this discrimination when facilities that are gender-based, like women's drug treatment facilities or domestic violence shelters, refuse to admit trans women. Their logic is often that other women will be triggered or made uncomfortable by trans women. This is what is called the bigot's veto in the law, a policy that allows the misunderstandings or biases of a general population in an institution to excuse the exclusion of a person with a characteristic that marks her as different. By shaping policy around the presumed biases or beliefs of the women in these facilities, administrators and other bureaucrats are verifying those biases or beliefs and saying that yes, trans women are not really women and do not deserve access to women's services. Another theme running throughout the policies that we are working to change is the idea that gender-confirming healthcare for trans people is not legitimate healthcare. Sometimes this healthcare is determined to be experimental or cosmetic, even though the same procedures and medications are readily provided for non-trans people to confirm their birth gender identities. Sometimes this healthcare is partially available, with extra regulation and arbitrary rules governing its availability, in a way that suggests that this kind of care should be discouraged. Other times, hormones or surgery are framed as something that may be legitimate for some people, but that people under a certain age are incapable of making decisions regarding this care. Many states explicitly exclude gender-confirming healthcare for trans people under their Medicaid plans. So even though they provide the same procedures and medications for other conditions, if your reason for needing a particular drug or surgery involves trans identity, the care is excluded. Federal law prohibits this type of, quote, diagnosis discrimination, unquote, by state Medicaid programs. They aren't supposed to give care to people with certain conditions and refuse care to people with other conditions just because some medical diagnoses are associated with politically unpopular groups. But nonetheless, most states do just that. Prisons are the same way. Many state correctional systems provide no trans care at all, but several states have a stranger rule. These states have written policies that will allow a person to access hormones in prison only if Z can show that Z was receiving hormones with a prescription from a doctor before Z was locked up. Granted, prison healthcare is atrocious for every prisoner, but the oddity of this policy illustrates the belief that this care is somehow not meeting a real need. This thinking is also reflected in the majority of juvenile justice and foster care systems that still deny trans youth access to hormones or any other gender-confirming care, forcing folks to get their care in informal and criminalized economies. You can also see this thinking reflected in the policies of community clinics that refuse to give trans healthcare to people under 18 because they don't think that young people have the capacity to understand and make important decisions about their own gender. Community, in quotes. Editor's note. This sets up a situation where young trans and gender non-conforming folks who want hormones end up locked up after trying to get these medications on the street or trying to raise money to buy them on the street, or they get HIV from using unsafe injection methods through lack of access to clean needles or basic supplies. These transphobic clinics see themselves as saving young people from making unhealthy mistakes, but only further endanger these young people by neglecting to address their healthcare needs. A final thread that runs through many of these policies is the notion that gender realness must be verified by medical doctors. The most blatant example of this are the myriad institutions that will only recognize a trans person's gender identity if Z can prove Z's undergone surgery, usually genital surgery. The Social Security Administration, the State Department, which issues passports, and the health departments of various states, which issues birth certificates, and many state departments of motor vehicles, which issues driver's licenses and non-driver IDs, will only allow a person to change her gender on record if Z can show Z's had genital surgery. Of course, most trans people will never undergo these procedures either because they do not want to or they cannot afford to, but will have to live day in and day out with an ID that does not match their gender identity or expression. The irony of these policies is that they usually have been made by people who know nothing about trans healthcare, and you can see that in their inconsistencies. For example, right now, if you were born in New York City, you can only change your birth certificate if you can prove you've had a vaginoplasty or phalloplasty surgery. However, if your neighbor who was born just over the city line in New York State's area of authority wants to change her birth certificate, Z will have to prove Z's had a penectomy or a hysterectomy and mastectomy. The bureaucrats who came up with their policy in the city wanted to see people with penises and vaginas to prove that they had become real men or real women. But the bureaucrats up in Albany wanted to see people who had removed their most gendered body parts in the eyes of those bureaucrats. From a layman's perspective, meaning genital-obsessed, binary gender-loving transphobia, both arguments make a lot of sense. From what I have seen working at Sylvia Rivera Law Project over the past 4 years, where we've provided legal help to over 800 trans, intersex, and gender nonconforming people, the tangled bureaucratic web that the state and the social services it pays for spin around gender is killing trans people, especially poor trans people. The contradictions don't seem to matter to the state. Sure, they refuse to recognize the legitimacy of trans healthcare for Medicaid purposes, but then they require it for ID purposes. Sure, they punish you for not having medical authorization to be yourself, but then refuse to see that medical authorization as legitimate when you need help paying for the care. Yes, being trans is real enough to get you falsely arrested and beaten, raped, or killed in prison, but not real enough to get you access to a domestic violence shelter, a drug treatment program that provides an alternative to incarceration, or a homeless shelter that recognizes your gender. We need to do more than hope that an anti-discrimination law passes in our state. We need to look at where binary gender is being required and enforced in the administrative institutions in our states and cities, and take local action to weed out such discrimination. How are trans people faring, not just in your school or office, but in the shelter in your town, in the jail down the street, in the prison out in the country? If we examine how the most highly regulated and surveilled people are doing, immigrants, folks on welfare, people who are locked up, youth, people living in communities overexposed to the police, we will see where gender regulation and coercion operate most sharply, and we can form shared analysis and coalitional activism to undermine those operations. That was Undermining Gender Regulation, written by Dean Spade, read by Naomi Kirst-Schultz.